Hello, my name is Melissa Treviño, Administrative HR Assistant for HFTP. Welcome to today's webinar, Prepare for Active Shooter and Workplace Violence Scenarios. It does apply to you. It is a reality that none of us wants to face. Active shooter incidents have been on the rise in recent years. Today, it is an unfortunate necessity that all hospitality venues have a plan in place to navigate this type of emergency and other workplace violence scenarios, while also ensuring that all employees are trained and informed of this plan. In this session, learn the practical steps your company can take immediately to prevent a potential active shooter situation, including smart hiring and firing practices, training techniques, and situational awareness. Our presenter today, Denney, JD, is an attorney and founder of Denney Law Group, a firm specializing in the counsel of restaurants, bars, and other members of the hospitality community. Welcome, David. At this time, I will turn the floor over to you.
Melissa, thanks, Trevor, and thank you for everyone who's joined us this morning. It's not the happiest topic. It's not the most exciting. Well, it's pretty exciting, but it's definitely not something that that hospitality companies like to think about. I have spoken on this issue multiple times, and it has become, I think, much more prevalent in the mind of the hospitality community as a whole since the Las Vegas shootings in 2017. But it's something that I focus on a lot, unfortunately. And you may remember back after 9/11 that the government had filmmakers and sort of action movie Michael Bay type people come to the government with crazy ideas about how terrorists might attack the United States. And so and when my mind goes to those dark places, sometimes I sit around and think about what are the ways that hospitality companies could be vulnerable. And large hotel chains and things like that have internal security departments, risk management departments that are fully tied into sort of the international pulse of terrorism and crime and domestic crime, but independents and small restaurant chains and hotel chains and especially private clubs who, virtually by their nature, are not part of a large corporate structure, sometimes managed by a corporate company, but frequently ownership of those clubs is not consolidated with other clubs. And so the smaller companies don't have necessarily a plan in place that will allow them to address these things with their employees, with their management, with their co-owners. And so that is where I've spent a lot of the time over the last couple of years in this space, is just making sure that people know where to go to get a plan, how to train on a plan, and how to sort of preemptively start thinking about hiring and firing situations that might reduce the likelihood of needing a plan, which is definitely the most important part of the situation, is to try to develop a plan that you hopefully won't have to use. But we've seen in the news hotel attacks in Europe. We've seen attacks in Mexico and Africa. We've seen, just, what was it, a week ago, we had this 4 people killed at a Waffle House by an active shooter. A lot of these things are completely unpredictable. Well, if they were predictable, we would address them. So really what we're training for is the ability to respond well in a situation that we hope will never occur. So I welcome your questions. I think this topic is incredibly broad, and based on the fact that every site is different, each one of your units, restaurants, properties, whatever, will have its own set of issues. And so what we'll talk about today is sort of a general outline of things to consider when you're working with somebody to put together a plan. I have worked with a group here in Dallas called Trident Response, which is a group made up of former Navy SEALs and government operators and things like that who do security and tactical planning and things like that. And they have, I actually presented with one of their people at our restaurant conference that our firm hosts back at the end of the year in 2017. And so some of this material is just things that I have gleaned from the former government operators. So that's a great help. And there are probably people like that in your communities with whom you can partner to put together an emergency action plan and to even come on property and help you assemble that and maybe even help train your people. So by way of introduction, that is where we find ourselves, and so let's get started. I want you guys to look at this first slide. These are 4 FBI law enforcement bulletins about emergency action plans. Schools, universities, houses of worship, hospitals and healthcare facilities, and there is not a guide to developing an emergency operation plan for hospitality or retail. I think that is a glaring omission. I think it's due to the fact that they're so bespoke and so unique that they couldn't really put together a guide that would be applicable across the board. But gosh, I feel like a massive industry has been left out. The reason being that the statistics are not in our favor. So these incidents are increasing, and almost half of them occur in commercial environments, whether that is on a job site or in a retail environment. And the reason is, of course, commercial environments are open to the public. And when you're open to the public, you're open to the risk that a crazy person is going to walk in with a gun and start shooting people. It doesn't necessarily affect the danger from a disgruntled employee or former employee, but it does impact the just sort of the universal risk that somebody's going to wander through your doors and you'll be the unlucky spot that they choose. So there was a poll recently, within the last couple of months, by a group called Food Service Training Portal that polled 200 independent restaurants. And of those 200, only 16 of them had any form of active shooter training, which results in 97% of them not having a plan. It's a very scary number to me, simply because the availability of a plan is not, we are not talking about thousands and thousands of dollars of out-of-pocket expense to prepare one of these. In my experience, it is a reasonably low cost and really can provide some peace of mind. Once you get over the initial discussion with your employees about why you're doing it. But with 45.5% of these occurring in environments that your companies have a presence in, I think that just the numbers don't lie. And from a hospitality perspective, following the Las Vegas shootings, which were not internal, obviously, they were external to the hotel, but I think it really has focused people's awareness on hospitality vis-a-vis active shooters. So let's look at sort of where is this coming from, right? And I've already mentioned most of this, right? Disgruntled or former disgruntled employees. What suggests that we need to establish smart hiring and firing protocols, and there we'll go over in a few minutes some considerations, especially when terminating an employee. Domestic violence is a high percentage of these incidents, whether it's domestic violence between employees or random domestic violence between guests. For example, a woman comes into a hotel lobby and finds her husband and another woman there, and begins an altercation. Right, that happens. I've seen them where they haven't escalated to gunfire, but I have seen them escalate very, very rapidly, and it's very uncomfortable for staff and other guests. And then, of course, the random premeditated attacks. And the glaring question of the day is, can these even be defended against? And to some degree, they simply can't. But what we have to do is be prepared if it does happen, because without a plan and without any training, we simply have lambs for the slaughter, whether it's our employees or our guests or anything else. And preparedness truly does work. And I don't think we should be training on this every week. I think that would be ridiculous, but I do think that some regular training on an emergency action plan, and most of you have fire plans, most of you have tornado plans, and I think just incorporating this scenario into that emergency action plan is critical. And so there are also ways we'll talk about to sort of make your property less attractive to random violence. And there are no guarantees, obviously, but what we want to do is simply be ready, be prepared. So let's see. I think this brings us to our first polling question, just to make sure that in the first few minutes nobody's dozed off. I know it's kind of early. I'm still working on coffee, but I'm going to turn it over to Trevor. I think we're turning it over to Trevor and not Melissa to do our polling questions.
Excellent, excellent. On your screen, you should see the first polling question. The question states, I feel this is an important safety issue for my business. There are three options: very, somewhat, or not at all. We'll give everybody about 20 more seconds to fill out this polling question. All right, at this time, 58% of attendees selected very, and 42% selected somewhat. All right, back to you.
Well, that's reassuring. I have spoken to club owners and well, really club management before, private club management, who have suggested that they don't believe that the club space is a high-risk target for an active shooter scenario. And I thought about that at length because I wanted to make sure that I had critically thought about it, and two, I wasn't sure if I was wrong about that, about my sort of passionate disagreement with that sentiment. But the more that I think about it, because of the nature of, I mean, really, this doesn't necessarily have to be ISIS or Al-Qaeda operating on United States soil. To some degree, this is all domestic terrorism, whether it's a madman with a gun or an organized ISIS sleeper cell or something. But it seems practical to me that the environment of a private club, with sort of the connotations that accompany the private club scenario, the country club scenario, and basically the fact that very, very few of them, while they may be gated, they're not actively closed to the world. It simply means that anybody can get on the property at any time. And as long as people can get on your property at any time, that is a cause for concern. And so I'm glad that I was hoping we wouldn't get any responses of this is not important to me because I'm in a private club and I don't think anybody's coming to our property. Nobody thinks they're coming to their property, whether it's a Hilton or an Outback Steakhouse or a country club. So with that, let's move on. We have a lot of great stuff to cover. So former employees and disgruntled employees, this is basically just a refresher or a primer on your HR system. And we've got a number of slides about smart firing. And I actually didn't even make a slide about smart hiring because to some degree, that's a gut feeling. The gut is this person going to be a good fit? The real question about what can you do is simply, do you do background checks? Have you vetted your provider? I mean, most people, 99% of companies out there are using third-party background check services when they do them. And there are some other employment law concerns about how you do them and why you do them. But assuming for a minute that you do them, are the results useful to you? And so can you have a situation where you're not background checking and you bring somebody in who has a violent past? That's basically letting a wolf into the chicken house. We shouldn't necessarily, I think I just mixed my farm metaphor, but forgive me for that. But a fox in the hen house, maybe that's what it is. But there are things that you can do in a pre-hiring situation, at least to the limited things you can do, you probably should be doing. But more importantly is during the termination process, because a lot of these incidents with former employees happen right after somebody is terminated. Even to the extent where somebody is terminated and goes out to a car and gets a gun and comes back into the space. So how is this handled, right? So face-to-face meetings tend to be the best way to do it. Of course, it happens where you've got no call, no shows, people don't show up again, they get terminated by text message, phone call, whatever. I understand that. None of these are 100% all the time rules, but what we're trying to do here is create sort of a best practice scenario for you guys to just sort of look back at, hey, how do we do this? Do we have we forgotten about some of these things? Have we not thought about them? Are there things that we're doing that maybe David hasn't thought about? So let's just go through this, right? So first of all, it's nice. It's professional to do a face-to-face meeting. And more importantly, whenever I'm terminating someone or counseling someone on termination, I want to remind them that what impact it has on my remaining employees. And they see that, and they see how you handle those terminations. So if you can block access to company systems, company information, email, etc., it's always important. Take a checklist with you so you don't forget anything. The return of company property is important. It can be a pesky roadblock to actually getting someone out and finally out, but allowing them to remove their personal belongings. State law will probably impact how and when you issue their final paycheck here in Texas. If they're terminated, they have to get their final paycheck within 6 days. But if they quit, they stay in the payroll cycle. So there are some little foibles that way. And do you have a witness about how the meeting went down? You don't necessarily need that, but it's always helpful. We are huge fans here of progressive discipline, not only because it helps fight off unemployment claims, but simply because it's a good way to run a company. And so most people use a system of informal verbal warnings, written warnings that ultimately lead to termination. And I think at that point, the way you view it is that person has succeeded in getting themselves terminated because you've given them every opportunity to succeed. But then you have a paper trail if you should need it. And simply in those meetings, especially when you have someone who is angry or aggressive, you won't want to provide a lengthy rationale for why they're being fired. You just simply stay on task. I try to do this when I have to. I won't say that I've never had a firing that has lasted an hour because I can't simply get the person to leave. Even I have had that happen to me, knowing this bullet point list in my head, like the 10 Commandments, but you do the best you can. We recommend that you don't leave the door open because things can escalate and it can disturb the employees around you. Retrieval of company property is here again simply because if you do not have a signed wage deduction authorization form, federal law will prohibit you from deducting anything from their pay. And as a result, you can't threaten to hold their paycheck if they don't bring back their company's cell phone, laptop, etc. So we incorporate a wage deduction authorization form in our employee handbook materials. They have to be signed. And people think about that usually in terms of uniforms and breakage and theft, but it's also a good way to ensure the return of your company property when you can hold back their last paycheck. So most importantly about following any employee's termination, you have to disable their access to the premises. You have to change the locks. You have to disable their key card. Key cards are, and they're $5. If you have a key card system, those key cards themselves are pretty cheap. And if they don't give it back to you, it is not a big deal. All you have to do is disable it. You want to change passcodes on passcode locks. A number of our restaurant clients have elected to go to passcode or key card access to the back of the house, employee entrances, simply because it is much easier to control access following a termination. And even though the labor market is really tight right now across the hospitality spectrum, it is still imperative that you regulate how and when people can get access to your space, especially former employees. Shutting down their email is an easy thing to do, but remembering to notify other employees is something people forget to do all the time. I mean, sometimes they wait till the next day or a couple of days later to sort of let staff know. Why this is critical is because if employees think that the terminated employee is still an employee, they will let him in the building. If she comes to the back door as if she was on the schedule to do violence on the property and no one knows that she's not an employee anymore, they won't know that they're not supposed to let her in. And that has caused many an issue, a violent issue, in hospitality because people forget their access key card, whatever, all the time, or just come back onto the property. And so just letting people know, whether you have a sort of a hot schedules sort of digital red book type software platform that or something else that allows you to mass text your employees, and you don't have to make a big deal about it, but you definitely should let people know simply because A, they'll be curious, and B, it keeps them from allowing access to the employees. And frankly, it should be a rule that you don't allow access to the premises to any unauthorized person. I mean, we should have that in our employee handbooks. That way, when people violate it, you can discipline them. I mean, people who let unauthorized people through the door should be disciplined, should be written up. And then make sure you remove them from the schedule. You let people know they're removed from the schedule. And then again, well, here's my reference to the wage deduction authorization form. And that may be the most practical takeaway out of this, is to make sure that you have those for all of your employees. So domestic and relational violence situations are much more intuitive. And you really have to be in a situation where you have management in place that can pay attention to their subordinates. And so if you have a manager who puts a lot of distance between herself and her employees, that is not the kind of manager who can have her finger on the pulse of a domestic situation that may be arising. And so, for example, if there's an employee who has obtained a protective order, a restraining order against a boyfriend or a husband or anybody else, will you know about that? Will they tell you? Do you have that kind of relationship? You definitely want to know that. And then you have to have a plan. If that person arrives on the premises, what do you do? Do you call the police? Do you have a manager empowered to address it, to get in between the employee and the domestic partner? But always, when in doubt, call the police, whether it's a guest-related or employee-related situation. And I'm not a big fan of putting other employees in the line of fire, but somebody has to be tasked with, hey, we know there's a restraining order. We think maybe you shouldn't be here. Why don't we just head on outside and, see on down the road? I mean, that in and of itself can diffuse a situation. So, I don't necessarily know that it's practical to send out a bulletin to your employees and say, hey, by the way, if you ever happen to get a restraining order against your spouse or loved one or, partner, you should tell us because we'd really like to know your personal beeswax. But to the extent that you do know, you should act on it or be prepared to act on it. And then other items are simply context clues. Has somebody been emotional, and this is where the plugged-in manager comes in, right? Has somebody had a change in personality, emotional issues? Is there something not right? Because those can all be signs of a domestic situation that's spiraling out of control, and you want to know if that's coming your way. In situations where it is guest focused, we don't have as much prep time for that. And whether it is a call to the police or again, a manager who can calmly walk up and try to diffuse the situation, that's definitely something that you want to think about. Going back for a second to the restraining order situation, which does happen. If you know about it, you should obtain a copy of that restraining order and hopefully a photograph of the person that has been restrained so you guys know if that person has shown up on the property, right? If you have on-site security, give the photo to them. Reception employees, management, anybody who would need to know as a gatekeeper, probably designating a manager or some representative from the company to be calm and approach that person is the best first step, or the policy could simply be, we will immediately call the police if that person comes on our property because we can't risk it. And then the third category that we identified is the random premeditated attack, and it is not just about Vegas, right? It isn't, and we've been talking about this since long before Vegas. So as of the Waffle House shooting a couple of weeks ago, there had been 67 mass shootings in the United States in 2018. That's four or more, for these calculations, that is 4 or more individuals being shot or killed, not including the shooter. 67's a lot. We're looking at a record number of gun violence victims this year. We're just on pace to outpace prior years. Unfortunately, it's probably a record that gets set every year. And because, as we mentioned, that hospitality properties are simply accessible to the public, they're particularly vulnerable to attack, just like private clubs. Virtually anybody can gain access. So one of the things to think about is, who are you hosting? Dallas, just this weekend, I'm sure every one of you on the news saw the news about the National Rifle Association convention. There were 80,000 conventioneers here, and there was some scuttlebutt about restaurants taking positions, anti-NRA positions, and getting viral reposts about it, things like that. But are you hosting that? Are you hosting a polarizing group on your property? Are you hosting a dinner, a gala, a ball, a luncheon? Are you having the bishop in for a gathering at lunch? Those can be situations that draw attention and can draw violent attention. So hosting one of those doesn't mean you're going to have a problem. It just means that if you are hosting something like that, you should think about it. And there's no question in my mind that most of the downtown Dallas hotels had increased security, increased police presence, and I tried to stay away from downtown because I don't like road closures, but with 80,000 conventioneers and a large number of protesters in downtown, security was of utmost concern, especially in a situation where all 80,000 of them are armed. So the entire downtown was on alert, right? And so you have to think about sort of the Boston Marathon situation. Are there races, protests, concerts? What is planned in the area of your properties that could cause overflow? There can often be overflow incidents simply from crowds moving, and that's just things you have to think about. So, do you do anything differently on large mass holidays like St. Patrick's Day or during the football playoffs? If your team is in the playoffs and you've got games there, stadiums can be targets, things like that. So just trying to sort of open the mind to additional areas of concern that have heretofore been ignored. So let's talk about situational awareness, because that's really what this is about. When you develop a policy, situational awareness is going to be the foundation of your policy. Your employees have to remain alert and vigilant at all times. And we're not necessarily talking about profiling guests. We're just talking about paying attention to guests. Is there anything off? We have an innate sense about other people, an innate sense of danger, an innate sense of propriety, that if the hairs on the back of your neck start to stand up, you should listen to them. So bulky clothes in summer, somebody talking to themselves or talking to the wind, the touching on the body is there because that is often the sign of somebody. They will check and recheck a concealed weapon. If they have a gun in their belt, you'll see them reach back and touch it. It's almost unconscious. Rapid blinking, increase in adrenaline. Are they standing in people's personal space? That kind of thing. And look, that could be anybody, but it also could be a situation that's about to unfold. And so the second part of a guest assessment factor is, does the person doing the assessing, do your hosts, hostesses, receptionists, do they have a way to communicate a potential issue to management, to the company? Is there a line of communication? Is there a code, a headset, an immediate text, anything that can allow that person a direct line of communication to tell someone, I think there is a problem here. And if not, you might think about how logistically you can implement that. And it's an interesting fact, and the Trident guys brought this up to me when we were putting our material together in 2017, but they said that the San Bernardino shootings, lots of people saw the shooters enter with weapons. And they thought they were filming a show. That's really scary to me, because in any urban scenario, I mean, gosh, Atlanta does so much filming. Dallas has its share of filming. People in California walk into movie sets all the time. New York, they're everywhere. And so in these larger urban environments, that could even be a concern that, gosh, I didn't realize those were real, because I just assumed they were shooting a show on the street and I didn't know about it. Because your employees aren't going to necessarily know one way or the other. They're just going to jump to the conclusion that it can't be somebody coming in here with a machine gun. So trust your gut until you are otherwise proven wrong. And Trevor, this is going to bring us to poll question number 2.
Excellent. On your screen, you should see the second poll question appearing momentarily. In states where legal, do you allow concealed handguns on your property? The options are yes or no. Give everybody about 20 seconds to fill out this polling question. All right, some results may still be trickling in, but at this point, we have 27% of attendees selecting yes and 73% selecting no. All right, back to you.
Okay, that's a pretty distinct difference. And I wish I guess I could have included a secondary poll question that said, and in states that allow concealed handguns, do you have a policy that governs how your employees whether they can or cannot bring guns onto the property? That is a separate issue that has to be specifically drafted in your employee materials. And it sort of the practicality of this policy works differently whether you are a hotel or a club or a restaurant, because if you don't allow concealed handguns in your restaurant and somebody's come down in an Uber, they don't have a car to go put their gun in or whatever. And so, there are some practical implications. Hotels have to determine whether they're going to provide lockbox services. If I've just driven in across the country and showed up at the hotel and I have a concealed handgun, I can put it in my car. But if I've flown in and I've properly checked my weapons with the airline and show up at the hotel with my reservation at 11 o'clock at night, and they tell me that they don't allow guns on the property, what then do we do with it? So I'm hopeful and presuming that most of the respondents who don't allow concealed handguns have sort of created, second and third step contingency plans for what happens if it becomes an issue. But generally speaking, and in my experience, most hospitality properties don't allow concealed handguns. And I guess, my only personal problem with that is that the bad guys don't respect the sign. And so, yes, they would technically be in violation of your policy, but they're also not going to pay attention to the sign. And a number of people that I've spoken with, including some of the guys at Trident Response, have said the perpetrator will then know the likelihood of someone inside having a concealed handgun is probably diminished, which might make it actually safer for the perpetrator. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But as we move from our second poll question, and time's moving pretty quickly in our webinar, at least it is for me. So the next thing we're going to talk about is in your training for your employees beyond situational awareness, which is a pre-incident training. You have to train on what do you do in the event an incident actually does happen. And crazily enough, the city of Houston has the term or the phrase "run, hide, fight" trademarked. They own the phrase "run, hide, fight." So here I'm appropriately giving them credit for having trademarked this phrase that is about as ubiquitous now as stop, drop, and roll was when I was a kid. But this is what you're training on. You're going to train people on where do they go, how do they get out of your property, and there are thousands of small coffee shops in America where there's one entrance and one exit, and people have described those as very dangerous kill boxes where you really hope you don't get caught when there's an active shooter. But luckily, most of our hospitality properties have lots of areas, well, not lots, but a number of areas of ingress and egress. You just have to let people know what is the best way to get in and out of the property. But practically, when you're training people to run, you also want to train them where to go. And this can also happen in fire training too. But where do they go after they've run? And you should designate sort of a Tier 1 and Tier 2 rally point or a muster point. They call them different things. But where do you go when you get off the premises so that we can take a head count? And the only way to ensure that people will do that is to have trained them on it. So determine where that is, off premise, a couple of blocks away maybe. The only drawback to that, really, and I haven't figured out yet a way to get around it, is that former employees will likely know where your muster points are. So, theoretically, they could go to a muster point to find additional victims. But I don't think we can do anything about it. I think we have to have a place for people to congregate because I think that the company itself has to have a way to get a head count. So, tell people to have an escape route in mind in advance, whether it's a loading dock or a side door, or to just think about if I'm in point A, how do we get outside? Teach them to leave their belongings. Help others out if possible, but if they are a delay or a detriment, you have to get out. You want to prevent others, like people on the street, from entering the property. Turn them around as you're fleeing. And keep them from going into danger. Any distance between the employee, well, let's just say you. Any distance between you and a shooter is better. Most of the kills that occur in these active shooter scenarios are short range or point blank shots. So they're not crack shots necessarily. And any distance you can put between yourself and the gun is good. Call 911 when you're safely away, and don't return until you receive the all clear. I was astounded by the number of photos I saw of the Vegas shootings where one photo specifically stands out in my mind, but I saw multiple photos of police officers crouched behind a police car with guns drawn and a guy standing up with a cell phone videoing the scene. That's insanity. So let's not do that. let's tell our people not to video on their way out. I'm always astounded by the amount of video of these situations that we have that is not security camera video. It's crazy to me that people are turning on their cell phones and videoing themselves fleeing from an emergency, but I've scoured YouTube, I listen to 911 calls. I really do spend a lot of time in kind of a morbid topic as a way to sort of help better the industry, but you would be shocked at how much actual video there is of nightclub shootings where people have their cameras on. It's absolutely crazy. So, sorry, I soapboxed there for a second. But running is the most important and number one thing. If you cannot run, then you hide. This is an integral part of training, too, because not everyone will be able to get out. Lock a door, barricade a door, close the blinds, turn off the lights. We see this a lot now especially since Parkland, about school shooting training, like lockdown scenarios, right? But this applies anywhere. Silence and turn off the vibration of a cell phone. Seems counterintuitive to turn off vibrate, but in silence, it can be very loud. Try not to hide in groups. Try to use a text message to get to police. And then find something large and then also possibly bullet stopping. If you can hide behind a big concrete planter and a thick wall, it's better than hiding under a desk. So this is the kind of thing that if you were to pair with a security service to help you develop a plan for your property, you could train on and you could talk about it, and they could understand on this property that's unique to your company, these are the kind of places where you could hide. And that is just a valuable situation because in a moment of panic, they won't default to that common sense answer if they haven't been trained on it. And then, of course, the last scenario is fighting. Because if you can't run and you can't hide, then, and like we saw in that Waffle House in April, the gunman was reloading, and that man just ran up and disarmed him, and he was injured, but he got that gun away, and there is no question in my mind that he saved a lot of lives that day because that guy was ready to keep shooting. Once you're committed, don't stop. Keep going. And I have a lot of these other pictures from another PowerPoint deck that I've done, but just putting the watch on the knuckles, boiling, scalding coffee, fire extinguishers, cleaning supplies, bleach, all your Ecolab products are very unpleasant to get in the face. Broken bottles, heavy bottles, pots, pans, fire, grease, anything, right? So at that point, it's medieval, but it can happen and it can work. And there have been scenarios where shooters have been subdued. And then let's talk for a minute about managing the crisis from a distance, because if one of these things occurs, it may not be that you personally are on the property, or your management or ownership or executive team might not necessarily be at the unit or on the property where this happens or when this happens. So if you get a text message that says, it's Jen, I'm in the freezer, there's a guy with a gun. I'm in the walk-in, there's a guy with a gun in the building. What then do? You have to think about, maybe this is manager training or even owner training. What do you do? How do you coordinate a response from outside the walls of the premises? So you'll make contact with law enforcement. You can try to get them access to your surveillance equipment. Can you provide them with a login? How quickly can you determine who is on the schedule? How do you let employees who may be coming in to work, either then or later that day, to stay away from the premises? How do you determine who's on the schedule, or guests or vendors, or who was scheduled? Was the HVAC maintenance person scheduled to come in today? Might they be there? And then where do you go from there? Do you go to the police headquarters? Do you go to the muster point? And some of that they'll tell you. law enforcement will tell you what to do. But I think in the absence of a plan, you go to the muster point and try to take your own head count of people that may have gotten out. And I didn't have this last portion about when the dust has cleared, how do you return to normal. I recently added that because there have been other Waffle House shootings. And one of the other ones that happened 2 or 3 years ago, it happened in the middle of the night, and an employee was murdered. And law enforcement came in and they took their photographs and they marked up the space and they did their investigation and they cleaned it up. And Waffle House was open for business later that day. They caught a lot of flack for reopening, for going back to work immediately after someone was killed on their property. And I mean, it's kind of a judgment call. I mean, they had a rationale. It wasn't arbitrary. And the manager said, we want to give the other employees as much a sense of normalcy as we can, and they're going to default to their routines, and if we're not open, they won't necessarily have a place to go and process that. So we're offering them the ability to come in and continue to be part of this family and do what they know to do. They took some, I think, unjustified heat for, being Machiavellian money grubbers, for, not being sensitive and closing the restaurant. Probably a judgment call there, but how do you return to normal? What do you do? It might involve counseling. It might involve, you might have people with post-traumatic stress. And really there's no script for that. It's just something that you want to think about. We will at some point have to return to normal. And so finding the shortest path to normalcy will be important. So moving into the next sort of phase of your employee training. It has been shocking to me, and I've said that 2 or 3 times, a lot of the stuff that I learn as I'm deploying this plan shocks me because I don't expect that employees won't know the address of the place they work. They'll say, I work at the so-and-so barbecue place on Main Street. They won't know that their building address is 123 Main Street. We're at the corner of Main and whatever. Or they might even say, I work at the barbecue place downtown, so-and-so barbecue downtown. That's not what the first responders need. So I guess I probably jumped the gun, and it's maybe on the next slide. But it's ridiculous that people don't, and we just don't think about it. I mean, I work in an office. I have to know my address. And so I hadn't thought about it, but, you have a place full of teenagers and millennials and young adults who are working in your, or whomever who's working in your company, of all lifestyles, of all education levels. They probably don't know the address of the building that they work in. So it never occurred to me that we would need to train on it. And once I learned it, it has been in my materials ever since. So one time somebody said, well, why don't we just pull the fire alarm and that lets people know that there's an emergency. And I just added here because that is a terrible, terrible thing to do because it's the opposite of a lockdown and it brings the wrong first responders, right? So most people to whom I've spoken about this say they would never, ever think to pull the fire alarm when there's a shooter on the premises, but because somebody did say it, I've decided that I'm going to implement it into our material. And so, here it is, do your employees know the address where they work? That's really important. Try to remain calm, easier said than done, but the first responders need to know as many details as possible, including how many people are there. Do they have rifles? Do they have pistols? Do they have machetes? How many people are hurt? Do you know anything about it? And where in the building are the bad guys? What do they look like? If you can tell, I mean, do they have is there a mustache? Are they wearing masks? Anything. And then the other part of the training is here's how to not get shot by the cops. Keep your hands visible, remain quiet, and the chain of students filing out of the Parkland High School is sort of a nice object lesson to this. Silently, quietly following instructions. And again, don't return. Don't return to get your stuff. Don't return to video. Don't return to check on anybody. You just have to stay vigilant because they might come outside. might be looking for more victims. It absolutely has happened. So what else can you do as a company to prepare your property to be safe? We talked about key card access to employee and back of the house areas. These blue lockdown alarms are in a number of buildings. They're definitely in banks. What it does is it locks down. I mean, it locks the doors, and so it has the advantage of preventing a shooter from getting into other areas of the property. What I tend to not like to think about is, what if there are people locked in with the shooter? That's sort of the flip side of that little blue box. But generally speaking, I think it probably does more good than otherwise. Do you have first aid kits? Are they stocked? Do people know how to use them? Usually you have one somewhere in an office, in a kitchen, but are they stocked? Do they have a map of the exits? I saw one commentator suggested to put a map of the building with the exits in the first aid kit, just to have a place to look for it. And then importantly, because a lot of our properties have patios, have large windows, we love patios. We love patios and hospitality. And in Europe, man, they are surrounding those things with concrete pylons or iron or things that are driven into the sidewalk that almost look, they look a little bit more attractive than the huge concrete pylons outside a Federal Reserve building. But there are definitely ways to prevent access from somebody driving a car into your building or onto the patio and killing everyone on the patio. It costs a little more to build, but that is a part of the planning that I think may be sort of the new normal, is to, even if you use topiaries to mask the patio to prevent people from seeing in, who's there, how many people are there, where can I aim? You have to sort of do the cost-benefit analysis between masking and view, but it's definitely something I would incorporate into the philosophical planning stages for future properties. And I've put together a list of resources that I think you may be interested in as you download the PowerPoint from today. So there are a number of videos that are developed by Homeland Security that you could incorporate into your training, and I just think that they're helpful. I think employees, when you start to train on this, think it's silly. I've seen them think it's silly. I've seen employees think that be afraid that there's been a threat against the property. I've seen a number of things, but these are really well done videos, and they're not long. And I think it would really just be an introductory step into a deeper discussion that you would facilitate with your people, right? So why do we want to plan? Let's talk about that. Summer 2017, in Club Trends magazine, they did a survey of 370 club executives, and I was actually surprised that 71% of the respondents had a formal policy or plan on active shooter, but I was not at all surprised that only 35% of them did regular training on it. So of the 71% who had the plan, only 35% are training on it. And with high attrition and sort of employee apathy, it's something that should probably be trained on quarterly, I would say. I mean, even bi-yearly is not enough, I don't think. Just my opinion. But I think quarterly is pretty solid. And you don't have to spend a whole day doing it. Now, if you were to do a large-scale annual training, and you have a large property, I would absolutely reach out to first responders and see if they will help you train. And if it's not a third-party security company, I would reach out to your local police department and see if they will send somebody or one or two people out to help you train on that. I think that they would be thrilled to do that. So consider developing a plan. Reach out to your first responders or a third-party outfit, and then consider developing sort of your corporate base plan that's applicable and customizable to all your units. And so every kitchen design is going to be different. Every property is going to be different. But as you sit and do a walkthrough of your properties, you'll be able to say, okay, this applies here, this doesn't apply here. And I think that will help you to think more critically about each one of the properties that you have to focus on, whether it be a restaurant, hotel, private club, bed and breakfast, you name it. Bar, I mean, obviously nightclub shootings are a real thing and have been for a very long time. That's where there's amazing 911 audio out of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Miami. I guess an important thing to mention about that particular tragedy is a number of people took wounded guests and left the property. So there's a 911 call of some people who had been at the club. They had a guy who had been shot in the stomach in their back seat, and they had left the property and they were driving somewhere, anywhere. They were just driving away. They called 911 and they said, we were at the Pulse nightclub, there's been a shooting, and they said, we know, where are you? And they said, we're in the car. No one will stop. Ambulances and police keep passing us. And the 911 operator said, of course they're passing you. They're going to the club. Where are you? They said, we're trying to get to a hospital. And they said, well, can you flag down an ambulance? They ultimately did flag down an ambulance, but if they had stayed on site, they probably would have been seen by an EMT far sooner than they did when they were driving away. And I know that human nature is, let's get out of here, but you have to know that that the first responders are on the way. So that was very instructive to just say, hey, gosh, tell your people to stay on site if they know that the EMTs are coming. That brings us to our last poll question. Oh, you know what? It's not. It's not our last poll question. I do want to focus on the last sentence here in blue. The worst plan that you could have is one that you wrote down and don't train on. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is it's not effective. Your people may or may not even read it if it's in their new hire packet. They definitely won't internalize it. And from a purely unemotional business standpoint, if you have a plan and you don't train on it and something does happen, then the flesh-eating plaintiffs' lawyers out there will determine that when they're filing lawsuits against you later, they'll say, you wrote a plan, you recognize the risks, you never trained on it, it wasn't important to you, you look negligent, all you wanted to do was make money, you didn't want to do the hard work. And this is my philosophy about any plan, is if it's a responsible alcohol service or sexual harassment or active shooter or fire, if you write down the plan and you've acknowledged that there's a reason to have one, but you don't train on it, you're just doing yourself a disservice and putting yourself at risk. So just from a pure liability standpoint, think about it that way, and it makes sense. And now it takes us to our last poll question. Trevor, do you want to take care of that?
Absolutely. On your screen, you should see the third polling question. Would you feel comfortable involving first responders in your active shooter workplace violence training? Yes or no? All right. At this point, the results are pretty conclusive. 100% of attendees have selected yes.
I love it. I love it. It doesn't have to be police. It can be EMT and fire, too. They have a really unique perspective because they're just as likely to be on site first. And they can very clearly articulate to your people, here's what we need to know when you call 911. We don't need, here's what we don't need, and here's what we have to have. And they're really great. So I think I haven't really left us a whole lot of time for questions, but I'm available for questions. So I don't know if we have any, but let's see.
All right, very good. We have two questions. Do employees freak out when you announce that you're going to train for an active shooter?
Oh, well, okay, so I touched on that for just a second. And I have been in situations where the employees have literally freaked out and specifically thought it was because a threat had been made against the property. But they don't freak out very long when you show them or remind them about shootings in restaurants, shootings in hotels, Mandalay Bay, et cetera, that you're doing it to keep them safe. And if you can convince them that nothing has precipitated the training other than a desire to keep them safe, they tend to appreciate it. So there may be a bit of initial freakout, but it's easily assuaged.
Very good, very good. And the second question, does a company take on additional liability when it develops an action plan? What if it isn't effective?
Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of a morbid question. What if it isn't effective? Well, the way that I interpret that question coming in is, what if I have a plan, something bad happens, and one of my employees gets shot? Am I going to get sued saying I developed a plan but it didn't work? So that's a tough one, because you definitely should have one. You cannot possibly account for all the permutations of reality that could occur. There are so many variables that you can't control. You can really just give them the best chance to do the basic run, hide, fight. I don't know how I said that. That was crazy. The basic run, hide, fight examples. And so do you take on liability by having a plan? Well, like I said a minute ago, if you have a plan and don't use it, you probably do. If you don't have a plan, you probably have more liability. But let's face it, if there's a scenario where there's an active shooter incident, it's just like the Southwest Airlines engine explosion from a couple of weeks ago. There are people who were not injured on that flight that have already sued Southwest. If there's an active shooter, you're going to get sued. There is zero chance you get out of that without getting sued. And that's a reason to make sure that you have good insurance. It probably will not be too long before insurance companies offer separate coverage or special coverage for this kind of event. It's just like the first few years of cybersecurity or PCI DSS, credit card, personal information theft. I didn't know it was a problem until they started offering an insurance product for it. And when they started offering an insurance product for it, I realized this is a real thing and it's never going away. And so somebody will start insuring this, and then across the board in the next few years, probably everyone will. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be an exclusion from general liability, and it'll end up being a rider you have to buy. But for now, just make sure that your general liability insurance is adequate, that it covers this. And I'm definitely not an insurance lawyer, but I know enough to say make sure that you're covered for whatever. But my gut has to say, not having a plan is more dangerous ultimately than having one, unless you have one and you don't use it.
All right, very good. Those are all the questions we have for today.
Oh, hang on. We got another one. We just had one pop in. Does a business assume any liability? Yep. Oh, you go ahead, Trevor. Sorry.
Does a business assume any liability for having a policy that prohibits concealed weapons carried by guests, assuming they are being carried legally, not locations serving alcohol, etc., typically?
I don't think so. I mean, in the states that allow concealed carry, every time I've ever looked into it, businesses have the right to exclude people from doing so on their property, and landlords too. Even in Texas, a landlord can override the business and say, "I don't want concealed weapons on my property," which is interesting. So does a business assume liability for having a policy that prohibits concealed weapons? I don't think so, as long as they're staying within the law. You would want to comply. So, for example, here the signage requirement is very, very specific, and the letters have to be 1 inch high, and it has to be posted at the entrance in English and Spanish, and it has to cite the code, various things like that. So assuming that you properly excluded conceal and carry permit holders from entering the premises, and even now in Texas we have open carry, so we have two signs, one that says no concealed weapons and one that says no open carry of weapons. But I don't know how you would assume liability for keeping people out when you have the right to do so. You might actually get some flack for somebody that says if something goes down, you'll be happy if you have us conceal and carry people inside to take the shooter out. And there have been a large number of situations where concealed handgun owners have been the ones to stop the shooter in the hospitality and retail premises. And those just never cease to amaze me. But I don't know that you would take on liability, especially when you're following the law. If the law in your state says people can carry a concealed handgun wherever they want, except for these 4 places, then you're not one of those places, and then you exclude somebody. You might theoretically have some liability, but I'm not familiar with anything that in any other state that would prevent you from doing that.
All right, very good. I believe that's all the time we have for today.
Thanks for staying a few minutes late with us, everybody. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I'm glad to know you guys think it's important too. Thanks so much.
Excellent. On behalf of HFTP, thank you all for joining today's event. This concludes our presentation, and you may now disconnect.